Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. And we're about to start here shortly our third panel, which is titled Regional Dynamics and the Great Power Competition, which is really to get after the theme that we talked about earlier this morning. But before we get started, I just wanted to share two quick administrative notes. For those of you just logging in for the first time, we are offering simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. So all you have to do is click on the icon. It looks like a globe on the bottom right of your screen. If you're using a phone, just click on more and it should appear as well. Buenas tardes todos. Los que están interesados en escuchar este panel en español, sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Lo único que uno tiene que hacer es apretar el botón en la parte inferior a la derecha de su pantalla, que hay un icono que parece un globo, el mundo. Si ustedes están usando el teléfono, nada más tienen que apretar la sección que dice More y ahí sale también el icono del mundo y eso te lo transfiere al español. Also, just a second administrative remark is we are going to offer a Q&A chat window. So, as you have questions or comments, please feel free to contribute through the Q&A chat window. We just encourage everyone to please add your name and organization when asking the question. Also, at this point, I'd like to introduce a colleague, good friend of mine, Dr. Benjamin Gedan, who is currently serving as the Deputy Director of the Latin American Program at the Wilson Center. He's also an adjunct lecturer here at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he'll be moderating our third panel for today. So, Dr. Gedan, thanks for joining us, and it's over to you.
Many thanks, Jim. Thank you for the invitation and for the wonderful day-long event. I'm so glad to be moderating a conversation about great power competition and how it is playing out in Latin America, a region of great interest to the United States and to other global actors. Within Latin America, of course, governments are consumed by other matters, principally the pandemic. The region has suffered the worst economic and public health consequences. The year of 2021 is the year of major elections. Legislative or presidential voting will take place in Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Honduras, Mexico, and Peru. Those are the issues most on the minds of Latin Americans, both political elites, economic elites, and the public. From the perspective of Washington, however, there has been and remains great attention paid to the role of external actors in Latin America. And by that, we of course principally mean China. To address that complex and increasingly important concern, I'm so delighted to be joined on this panel by Craig Deare, a professor of national security affairs at the National Defense University, Fabiana Perera, assistant professor at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, and Brian Fonseca, the director of the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. We're going to address this issue amongst ourselves and then with our panel and ultimately with your questions as well from many angles, both geopolitical and economic, infrastructure and trade. We will start with you, Fabiana. For the first time since 2006, China's two policy banks did absolutely zero lending in Latin America in 2020. This was not merely an artifact of the reductions in trade due to the global pandemic, but rather it followed years of declining Chinese state financing in the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, for its part, the United States has established a new agency, the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, with the goal of increasing U.S. economic engagement in emerging markets such as Latin America, explicitly to contest influence with the Chinese. My broad question for you to start this discussion, Fabiana, is whether any of these developments actually matter, which is to say, is Latin America a meaningful battleground for great power competition between the U.S. and China? If it is, does the new U.S. administration have an opportunity to compete with China and Latin America, at least on infrastructure finance, now that we've seen a declining role for China's state-owned banks?
Thank you, Ben, for your question and for joining us. It's an honor to be on a panel with you and with Brian and with Craig, all people I admire so much. And just to reiterate what my colleagues have said, as an employee of the Perry Center, I am so grateful to SAIS for co-hosting this event with us for the third year in a row. My husband, who's a SAIS alum, is very happy that I'm here today. So I think to address your question, I think the developments you mentioned very clearly highlight the existence of competition in Latin America. I think it's hard to look at a figure like 25 billion in loans from China for infrastructure projects in Latin America, followed by the creation of a US institution specifically to finance infrastructure in developing countries, and argue that there's no competition. I think the facts are very clear that there is competition for Latin America now. I think where we come into a little bit of an issue is on what we decide to term this dynamic, whether we call it great power competition, strategic competition, or external actor influence. I think all the terms are describing the same dynamic. Perhaps at times the great power competition term, which is the most thoroughly described in academic literature, might be maybe a little bit of a stretch to describe the dynamic, but there is competition happening in Latin America. And I believe this competition is likely to intensify in the coming years and to stretch, as you said, across a number of issue areas. In that sense, I think when people hear great power competition, the immediate focus is on defense and security. And as you highlighted in your question, I think this is something that goes beyond defense and security. To address the lack of investment in the last year, I'll say that we should, because this competition is real and likely to intensify, we should not interpret a lull in Chinese investment of 1 year after 15 years of continuous investment as a sign that the competition is over or that they gave up or that it's overplayed. 2020, as everybody knows, was an extraordinary, difficult, and different year. So I think we should kind of set that aside and instead, and regard the competition very much as continuing, which is something that Dr. Paul Angelo also highlighted in his remarks during our first panel. So I agree with him on that point. I would like to make 3 points today. The first one is broadly what I already covered. Powerful states are competing to provide solutions to problems facing the region. This is obvious from the infrastructure example, but it's also happening across a number of issue areas. We were just fortunate to hear from Dr. Dubois and Dr. Ugarte about vaccine distribution. And this is an area where competition is intensifying among the capable great powers of the world in Latin America. So the first point I want to make is that competition is real, and accepting that the competition is happening is going to be key to coming up with good policy solutions from a US perspective. My second point is that the solutions that are being presented by these states that are competing in Latin America are not equal. They represent that state's idea of what the right way to organize the world is. That is, they're loaded with that state's own values and perceptions of the importance of democracy, capitalism, and the right way to organize society. Another way of thinking about this is that there are no solutions being presented to Latin America that come with no strings attached. They're just different strings. And that's my second point. Often I think we hear reporting of, to go back to your example, loans issued by China to the region as being no strings attached because they don't have specific human rights considerations. I want to refute that and say that there are strings, but there are strings that are consistent with China's views of the world. What I'm talking about here is that oftentimes the conditions on these loans are murky, oftentimes even to the origin country itself, where some of these are regarded as state secrets, so that it's not possible for the government to fully understand what they're getting into. And concerningly, it's not possible for citizens to have transparency to evaluate the decisions that their leaders are undertaking on their behalf. So my first point is that there is competition. The second point is that this competition creates an array of different solutions for Latin America, each of them attached to the views of the country that's providing the solution, such that none are no strings attached. Just from a US point of view, we place value in human rights and democracies and attach some of those conditions to our aid. Other competitors value different things and attach different conditions to their aid. The third point that I want to make, which is in keeping with the theme of the event today, is that many of these challenges that are attracting competition into Latin America are challenges where the region has an opportunity to step up and coordinate and provide regional cooperation and leadership. In our region, we have a country that is almost large enough to be at the same level as the great powers that we've been talking about. So this creates opportunities both for Brazil to exercise leadership, but also for the region to coordinate. And where I think it would be important to coordinate is in thinking about how to holistically evaluate the proposed solutions that are coming from external actors into the region, so that countries can make a decision that is best individually for them and their citizens, but also in the best interest of the region as a whole. The big challenge here, and with this I would like to conclude, is that to be able to evaluate these solutions holistically requires a level of good governance and of state capacity that has been challenging for some of our states to achieve to date. And Dr. Corrales discussed this in his panel. That whole early morning panel addressed this issue. So I would say here's an opportunity where the US can help our partners in the region build more capacity so that they can make informed choices and evaluate the competition and solutions that are being offered to them. And I'll wrap up. Thank you for the opportunity to address this.
Many thanks, Fabiana. So the competition is real, it exists, and it's meaningful, and the way countries engage with China has strings attached, indeed, just different strings and ones that are of strategic interest to the United States. Thank you so much. Very, very helpful framing. A reminder to those listening, particularly students, but others as well, that you're more than welcome to submit your questions. Please identify yourselves and your institutions if you would be so kind. We will review them and get to them after our initial insights from our panelists. I want to turn now to Brian Fonseca. Brian, U.S. concerns about China's role in Latin America are hardly confined to the Chinese investment in the region that we've been discussing and that Fabiana looked at in detail. One example that strikes me as interesting and somewhat new was earlier this year when the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Stone deployed to South America as part of Operation Southern Cross. It was an effort to combat so-called illegal, unregulated, and unreported, or IUU fishing. The U.S. Southern Command, or Southcom, says its heightened focus on IUU fishing reflects the priorities of Latin American governments, which are struggling to police their own maritime territory, to protect fragile ecosystems, and to protect the livelihoods of Latin American fishermen. Is the sudden U.S. focus on IUU fishing merely a way to shame China, or are the U.S. armed forces genuinely concerned about marine protection? Are we also addressing Latin American and other Asian fishing fleets that overfish in the South Atlantic? What do you make of this intense focus on what had been a concern mostly for environmental protection NGOs and activists?
Thanks so much for that incredibly complicated and tough question, Benjamin. Before I render an answer, I want to also thank the organizers for pulling this together. It is an absolute honor to be on the same Zoom with Fabiana and Craig. Folks I hold tremendously dear and have worked with over many years. Okay, Benjamin has a tough question, but let me see if I can tackle it. I think. Look, given the large role that China plays in illegal fishing, what they classify as illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, it would be easy, I think, to perceive the U.S. government actions as being those to really counter, or as you point out, shame China. On the other hand, I also think it's important to note that it isn't just China, as you sort of referenced. I think there are other countries that also have tremendously poor records when it comes to illegal, what we call IUUF. And there are sort of have major deep water, fleets, and that includes Russia, Spain, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. There are also some Latin American countries that are also guilty of IUUF, and that includes Ecuador with shark fins, Nicaragua, Venezuela, sort of breaching, EEZs. And so this is not just about China. That said, China's distant water fleet numbers about 3,000 vessels. And what's happening is as fishing stocks in the South China Sea and closer to mainland China become increasingly overfished, Chinese distant water fleets have moved further and further away from their region And this is why we're seeing an increased presence of Chinese distant water fleets all over the world. Chinese distant water fleets are spotted off have been spotted off more than 100 different countries, to include, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean. And sort of these Chinese fishing, I think one of the things that sort of raised it for the United States was sort of this concept of threat centricity, and security professionals certainly be familiar with this. In sort of U.S. engagement, so taking a look at the U.S. perspective, as U.S. begins to engage and find meaningful ways to deepen its partnerships with its countries across the hemisphere, it looks for things that sort of have threat centricity. In other words, it's tough, and we often in the U.S. get criticized for pushing Latin American partners to pick up national security interests that are really perceived as national security interests in the United States, but aren't as overwhelmingly prioritized with our partners in Latin America. And one of the things I think the U.S. has been hearing over the last several years is that illegal fishing has become a major threat issue that Latin American countries have been picking up on. And I think this is the way of the United States saying, hey, this is an issue that has threat centricity. It addresses some of our national interests, our security interests, as well as the security interests of our partner. And that's notwithstanding sort of global competition. I think that's part of it, but it's also the broader ecological and environmental impacts that we're seeing around the world. I think right now the stat is roughly 90% of the world's fishing stock is classified as overfished, which means that there's a massive depletion of fishing protein around the world. And these illicit actors that are working in this illegal fishing space are largely responsible for that. And so I've actually heard several of our partners from Latin America reach out to the United States and ask for assistance on this specific issue. And because the United States has identified it as a broader global issue that has impact, not just in sort of this global competition space. I mean, it happens to be China that's really, sort of on the brunt end of this. And I want to pick up on something that Fabiana said, so I'll come back to this sort of competition versus collaboration, because I think she's absolutely right in terms of how we think about the competition. There are opportunities for collaboration, and that may be something that the United States is really trying to push China towards, is collaborating around this issue and trying to bring the Chinese into managing its distant water fleet in a more meaningful, in a responsible way, so that it doesn't impact, the broader ecological, environmental, and sort of the social and political issues that are exacerbated by what you're seeing off the coast. To try to give, sort of a few stats on illegal fishing as a whole. And again, what we're seeing is that it's one of the top three, it's one of the top three communicated threats by all coastal nations, in our region. It's one of the top three threats that we're seeing, alongside fighting transnational criminal organizations, by the way. On a global impact, IUF is a global issue with significant sort of converging issues. That's issues of human rights, environmental sovereignty, economic development, security, cyber, as well as sort of that convergence with transnational criminal organization. We're also seeing that illegal fishing is ranked right now, based on the stats we have, as the 6th largest illicit activity, and sort of generates somewhere between $15 and $36 billion annually. But like I said, there's these other really, awful criminal activities that intersect with what we're seeing, at sea. And that includes everything from murder and sea slavery to instability caused by theft, illegal whaling, piracy, tax evasion. I mean, there's lots of other, corrupt and criminal activities that sort of are packaged in this one particular issue. And I think, again, I found that, Latin American partners have been reaching out to the United States for several years now. And I think it took a while for the United States to recognize the importance of the issue itself, notwithstanding that, again, it had this threat centricity that became really important for the U.S. to pick up on. But it also included other global powers that needed to be held somewhat responsible, for their actions in this particular space. And so I want to wrap up. But before I do, I want to sort of lean on something that Fabiana said, because I think it's really fascinating. We think of the global competition, and oftentimes I think we get hung up thinking about global competition as zero-sum, as a zero-sum game. And I think this is where Fabiana's comment is really useful, is that, many of these relationships, there are, we have to disaggregate the good from the bad, and we have to disaggregate, how we approach, the different, global, competitors that we're interacting with, and find also meaningful ways to, to collaborate. Here's an issue, illegal fishing, in which we know it's important for our partners in the region. It's probably important for China's partners in the region. And here again is an issue that I think we can collaborate and rally around. And it demands some, some action by the Chinese government to help manage, the proliferation of Chinese distant, deep water fleets as well, distant water fleets. So I think that, I'll end there so I don't rant, but I'll be happy to follow up and deepen it in questions. But I do, to just final pin on your question. Yes, it has to do with China, but it's not just about China. It's a bigger issue that I think the United States has recognized, and it's using it as an issue to build deeper, more meaningful partnerships with its partners in the region, because it's a big issue for its partners too.
Many thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Apologies for the complexity of the question, but you were, as I expected, up to the task. We are now going to turn to a broader geopolitical concern. Before we do, I want to remind everyone to continue submitting your questions. They are excellent so far, and we're accumulating a lot of them, but please continue to reach out. This question is for you, Craig. We've looked at concerns about Chinese investment in Latin America. Brian just laid out for us a rather novel security and environmental concern related to Chinese overfishing in the South Atlantic. I want to talk about Taiwan now. In recent years, the United States has ramped up efforts to defend Taiwan's diplomatic interests in Latin America. That region, of course, is home to 9 of Taiwan's remaining 15 diplomatic allies. In 2008, the most stark example was the State Department's decision to pull its most senior diplomats from the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Panama, after all 3, over a period of a year or so, had severed diplomatic relations with Taipei in favor of establishing formal relations with Beijing. The following year, the United States, for the first time, gathered Taiwan's regional allies for a so-called Friends of Taiwan Summit in order to show support and make sure that these governments were maximizing the advantages they get from maintaining their diplomatic ties with Taipei. Craig, my question for you is whether the United States is right in prioritizing this issue in its broader Latin America policy, or even as one of the elements of its competition with China in Latin America. And more broadly, how important is Latin America as a battlefield in this global great power competition? Assuming again that it's worth competing with China, both globally and hemispherically, how important is the competition in this region so close to the United States?
How about now? Can everybody hear me?
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so thanks for the question, Ben. Good to see you. Before I answer, let me add my thanks to the organizers. As a SAIS grad and a former faculty member at CHDS, it's kind of like old home week. And beyond that, to share the panel with Fabiana and Brian is a treat. And it's also good to see you two again, Ben. It really is. I should hasten to add before I continue that everything I'm about to say are my personal views. They don't represent those of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. At times, I say things that cause people to kind of cock their heads, and I just wanted to make that clarification up front. So it's an interesting question. But I would argue that whether or not to focus on just Taiwan or on those countries is a little tactical. I would recommend that we sort of back up and take a broader geopolitical view of what's going on in the world within the current contemporary security environment. So the term of our great power competition came about, or at least we started to use it more frequently with the the previous administration's national security strategy and with the national defense strategy. And so the challenge that the US has is recognizing, in my view, the nature of the competition, to use Fabiana's term, or political warfare, to use a different term, to use Kennan's term, regarding how the United States, as one of a number of great powers or major actors in the international system, is moving beyond the unipolar moment that we had following the Cold War, and how we are going to deal with not just China, but Russia primarily, and to a lesser degree, Iran. So how the US responds vis-a-vis Taiwan is interesting, but it's not enough. I think the US needs to recognize that that the role that China is playing is not dissimilar to the role that the Soviet Union played during the Cold War. The key difference, of course, is that during the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union and leading with their military that represented an understandable threat, both geopolitically and ideologically. And coming out of the Second World War, it was very clear to especially US policymakers, but I would also say to the American public, that this was serious stuff and we had to prioritize accordingly. Fast forward 50 plus years, and we win the Cold War, right? There's the unipolar moment, which ends abruptly with the 9/11 attacks in 2001. But during which time, China really went through this very interesting metamorphosis, if you will. The same country that suffered through the Great Leap Forward, 30 million people dying under Mao, and then eventually kind of getting that their economic system wasn't working, the policies of Deng and others, and how they began to recognize the utility of a market-based system, but coupled with an authoritarian regime such as the Communist Party of China. And it's fascinating to see how in a relatively short period of time, from Tiananmen in '89 until the US accepted, or along with the other actors, of course, China into the World Trade Organization, despite that legacy of and continuation of authoritarian rule. And we see that continue today. And what I think US policymakers fail to recognize, and do so at our collective peril, is that China as a civilization understands this concept of strategy. And they understand that to defeat an opponent, you don't necessarily have to engage in a symmetric manner. No one in their right mind would engage the US military in a force-on-force symmetric role, especially China circa 2001. But what did they do? They actually have been able to counter us using our strength. I mean, prior to World War II, of course, our strength wasn't our military, it was our economic prowess. And we used our economy in what Blackwell calls geoeconomic terms, using all instruments of national power, but in particular, the economic tool. And here we are in a situation where in 20 years, the US has gone from being the number 1 trading partner of over 120 countries in the world. And when China in 2006, I believe, was number 1 trading country of about 70 countries in the world. And in a scant 5 years, that flips, and China becomes the #1 trading partner for over 120 countries, and the US goes into a second place status. And so what I'm attempting to say is that the US policymakers, perhaps because we're not coming out of a World War II environment in which security is our #1 concern, but the rise of China is seen as more benign. After all, again, the Clinton administration encouraged the arrival of China into the WTO, thinking that, well, with economic liberalization will come political liberalization. And of course, that hasn't been the case. And the concern for the region, a region which is characterized by authoritarian leaders, by populist leaders, by the cacique, by the caudillo, what a wonderful combination to be able to achieve economic benefits using the Chinese model and retaining authoritarian rule. So I see you've appeared on camera. That's my clue to be quiet. I could go on for quite some time, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Actually, it's the reverse, Craig. I've returned to ask you a follow-up question. I think the focus on the authoritarian nature of the Chinese system, I think, is really relevant here. When looking at this great power competition, one could simply interpret it as another power that is seeking diplomatic and economic benefits at the expense of the US and leave it there. Here, though, there seems to be this other element, which is a region, as you've described, with relatively new and quite vulnerable, fragile democracies that is drawing much closer to a country with a very different political model than we support in the United States, which is, again, the authoritarian and repressive model in China. How much of that is a factor in your mind, or should it be, when we consider China's increasing role in Latin America, the nature of the government?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think it's absolutely huge. And again, the ongoing challenges that we see in Latin America, and of course, it's always dangerous to generalize about a region that is as distinct as has as great heterogeneity as does Latin America, from a Brazil to a Nicaragua, right? But what the region shares, with the distinction of Portuguese imperial colonization and the Spanish colonization, was the imposition on top of already predisposed hierarchical and authoritarian groups of people, these notions of patrimony, collectivism, hierarchy, authority, and so the challenge that we have seen across the region is how both political and economic elites have attempted to develop their own political and economic systems, their systems of justice, which in many cases have simply fallen short. So with weak levels of governance throughout the region, it is a ripe environment for a Chinese model to enter. As Fabiana mentioned earlier, there are strings attached, right? When the U.S. comes, whether it's through Exim Bank, foreign direct investments, some other efforts through the IMF or whatever, there are certain rules in terms of macroeconomic reforms, fiscal reforms, and the like. The Chinese say, no problem, you need some cash, here's the cash, and this predatory lending then sets the hook. And as I teasingly say to audiences whenever I have the opportunity to travel to Latin America, is my concern, because of those underlying weaknesses that we agree upon, is if the US isn't careful, and if the region isn't careful, in 50, 75 years, perhaps less, people in the region will sort of cock their heads and say, hey, you remember the gringos? Yeah, you know, they weren't the best, but my goodness, these Chinese, and at that point, it's too late. So yes, serious concerns.
Fabiana, we have a question, I think, highly relevant to what Craig was describing about the way China engages in Latin America and the opportunities or potentially risks of the U.S. not sufficiently engaging in institution building, which is to say a region with these fragilities in terms of the strength of democratic institutions facing a country like China that's engaging not in the kind of technical support that we think of when we think of development aid, but rather mostly focused on foreign investment and trade. So the question, which comes from Neil Myers at National Defense University, is how is the U.S. assisting in institution building, which you referenced in your initial remarks? And I would add, in light of what Craig has just said, whether it's sufficient to address these vulnerabilities.
Thank you. I would start by saying that we are doing some of this. I think what I tried to convey in my remarks is that I wish we would do more. I think that that's one of the most promising ways forward regarding competition. When I mentioned state capacity in my remarks, I meant it very much as a political scientist might. I mean, it's literally the ability of these countries to do what states are supposed to do, which is to raise money to be able to provide citizens basic services at a minimum security. Where I think the US can play a role there is through programs that strengthen the institutions, by which I mean the bureaucracy and the professionals that work within that bureaucracy, and give them the tools that will enable them to understand the importance of transparency, understand and have the technical background to be able to evaluate these proposals, to see that it's not yes strings versus no strings, but identify the different kinds of strings and make a decision as citizens of their own country that is in the best interest of the country they work for and represent of the citizens that live there. I think we do this to some extent through programs, including some programs from the Perry Center where we provide education to partner nation people working in ministries of defense. I think we can do more. I think this is a great area of promise because as we can see in this panel, if the US has something great to export, it is great minds that are thinking about these complex governance programs. Over.
Thanks, Fabiana. Brian, we have a question about so-called vaccine diplomacy, mask diplomacy, medical diplomacy, an issue obviously of major concern. You know, I'll add that there was a perception early in the pandemic, at least, that China was outmaneuvering the United States in rapid deployment of PPE and other support, and now is doing the same with the deployment of its vaccine. The same could be said for Russia, its Sputnik vaccine. An early adopter was Argentina, and now has become popular throughout the region, whereas the United States is not and won't be for months in a position to export vaccines to Latin America, though it has joined the COVAX effort financially to support the distribution of vaccines in the emerging markets. Brian, what are the long-term effects you see from medical diplomacy?
That's a great question. I think we're still trying to assess sort of long-term effects of medical diplomacy. I mean, but at the end of the day, I think it's merely another instrument or lever of influence that is being used as part of the competition. I mean, there's a vacuum right now. There's an opportunity space for competitors to play in, and that's exactly what they're doing. I don't think it's incredibly unique from other forms of diplomacy that China, Russia, or the United States had levied to try to deepen influence, expand relations, build, sort of connective tissue and dependency, on what, big powers have to offer to the region. And so I see it as part of that broader portfolio of elements that countries are leveraging to, again, expand influence. I think, one thing is what we see with the PPE and vaccine distribution. The other is the, sort of the eroded state of public health in Latin America, which I think is a much bigger issue that demands much more attention, that's not satisfied by simply the shipment of vaccines to support, a tactical near-term issue related to the vaccine, but going back to the long-term development and sustainability of the institutions that are designed to provide against the public good, which is what Fabiana and Craig have talked about. And so Those are opportunity spaces, though, that I think, that vaccine or this sort of health diplomacy can move and sort of expand them into, is to now reworking the public health sectors, which are in absolute disarray as a result of the pandemic. And those are opportunity spaces. And so you could see this expand beyond, just sort of the distribution of material to, sort of deeper inroads to actually help build, public health systems that are dire, that have stronger connective tissue with sort of our competitors.
Excellent. I know USAID has been engaging in this sort of over the horizon thinking from fairly early on in the pandemic, which is identifying the vulnerabilities in the public health sector in Latin America and figuring out ways to build institutions of the way that Fabiana was describing, rather than a more transactional approach that you could describe the Chinese engagement, donations, but often mostly sales of medical equipment, and now vaccines. We have a question from James Bosworth of the Latin America Risk Report. Craig, I'm going to put it to you. The U.S. history in Latin America is far from perfect, to say the least. As China increases its presence and influence in the region, it's also not going to be perfect. What mistakes is China making today in Latin America? Are they taking actions they'll regret in the near future? What mistakes are they likely to make in the coming 5 years?
That's a really interesting question. And I would be the first to recognize that absolutely the U.S. Role in the region has not been perfect. Indeed, how we engaged with the Soviet Union through proxies and directly in the region is responsible in part for what the region looks like today. So I take that on board. In terms of what mistakes the Chinese are making, I think they're playing a pretty good hand very well. And they're able to do so because of, again, of the instrument that they're using to play it with. Their demand for Chilean copper, Argentine soy, Bolivian lithium, you name it. I mean, it's a win-win, right? With the exception that there is no value added going on in manufacturing terms or precious little in the region. And so the terms of trade are to China's benefit. And the concern is with some of the more mature countries and some of the more middle of the road political systems who are savvy enough to trade and to take limited investment on their own terms. But we've seen numerous cases, the Ecuador case, we won't even talk, we could mention the Venezuela case, but that's a unique case, which I'm sure we'll come to in a little bit. The Argentine case, where again, because of the authoritarian populist tendency of a particular leader who is less concerned about the well-being of their own country 10, 15, 20 years from now, they're concerned about short-term political wins. That's a ripe environment for which Chinese actions to prosper, and we see it up and down the coast in Central America, of course, and in the Caribbean. It's I think by the time the region, and I use the term the region again, it's a geographically coherent region, but it is not a politically or economically coherent region. 19 separate sovereign countries. By the time many of these countries figure out what's happened to them, it may be too late, and they're on the hook for a long time.
Brian.
Thanks, Ben. I mean, I think Craig hit it on the spot. Maybe something I would add, or at least deepen, is that I don't think China is building the true deep-rooted relationships with the region, and that a lot of the activities appear far more transactional and opportunistic. And again, I don't think they're building the kind of deep, long-term, enduring relationships in the region. I think that's one maybe misstep in terms of a broader, longer term strategy for the Chinese. The other thing I think, and by the way, I think James could have answered this question himself. He's brilliant in it. But he's right. You know, we have some historical baggage that we've worked really hard to reconcile with the region. I think China's building some of that baggage now. The fact that they bypass environmental laws, labor laws, I mean, they don't play by the rules of the game that a lot of a lot of sort of democratic institutions in the region have sort of begun to embrace, bypassing rule of law. I think those things are going to come back to bite China in the rear when they want to deepen those relationships. And as the pendulum continues to swing between political actors in the region, they find themselves out of favor, with changes in government and not having the deep-rooted influence and institutional relevance. I think that's going to come back to bite some of the long-term aspirations that they have.
Fabiana, we have a question from Buenos Aires related to U.S. security cooperation in Latin America, in particular in this case, the cold reception that Argentina gave to Operation Southern Cross that I referenced earlier. We don't have time to get into all the logistical details of what went on in that particular case, but I do wonder whether that's a signal that some of the relationships that have grown slightly distant over the last few years will have real implications for U.S. security cooperation in the region.
I'm going to speak broadly, but then I would feel bad answering a question about Buenos Aires. So I'm going to switch roles with you and let you talk specifically about Argentina. I will say overall that what I get from this is the idea that competition is constant. This is not a situation where the United States or China or Russia can feel like they're ahead and kind of lean back. I'm a runner, so I would say we're like on mile 7 of a marathon. We still have 19 miles to go. It would be foolish of us to say the United States has the longest and deepest ties to the region. That's enough and set back. I do certainly think there's opportunities for cooperation, but I think they have to be evaluated in the spirit of us offering the best possible alternative to the regional partners. And I think something like this suggests that's right, that we can't just take, none of these countries can take a hands-off approach, and that the competition for Latin America is intensifying. But I wouldn't ever answer something about Argentina when we're fortunate enough to have you here.
I'm not sure you're allowed to ask me questions, Fabiana. Before I weigh in on Argentina, then maybe at least tell me a bit about Chinese engagement when it comes to security cooperation, when it comes to capacity building, when it comes to foreign military sales. Where do you see the Chinese engaging, not on the trade and economic issues that we mostly focus on, but really on the mill-mill relations that I think don't get enough attention?
Thank you. I think the mill-mill relation is not the strong suit of China when it competes to Latin America. That said, they are gaining an advantage that can down the road convert to military advantage. And I think they're doing this through strategic acquisition of assets that could in turn have a double use as military assets. I'm speaking, of course, of ports and Chinese acquisition of ports in Latin America. At first glance, or at any glance really, that's not a mill-to-mill engagement, but it does put them in a position in our own hemisphere that would result in an advantageous, in something advantageous when it comes to hard power a few years down the line. I think that's more the position they're taking, is investments and engagement through economic ties and diplomatic ties in a way that can serve this dual purpose. And I think because there's a dual purpose, it might at first not appear obvious to us. And there's plenty of stories about this from people. I've heard Ambassador Main speak about being in El Salvador at the time that the Chinese expanded their port acquisitions there. I think that's more the direction they're heading, and that we're right to not focus on the mill-to-mill side, but rather to pay a lot closer attention to the economic dimension specifically, even above the cultural, as a potential area where they could be harnessing a military advantage.
Thanks, Fabiana. I guess very briefly, if you insist, I'll say that I think the the Argentine government in general, its approach to the United States, I think right now, there are conflicts within the Argentine governing coalition, which is quite diverse. And there are certainly elements that would rather see greater distance between the United States and Argentina. And in fact, for geopolitical and ideological reasons, would rather have closer relations with US adversaries such as Russia and China. I think the president of Argentina himself is probably not among them, except perhaps when it comes to security, which traditionally in the president's circle has been an area of discomfort when it comes to close cooperation. And so that will seem like a stark departure from the last Argentine government, which really explicitly tried to coordinate with the United States. The current government may see hemispheric defense as an issue for Latin Americans and not to be driven out of Washington and the multilateral institutions that we favor in the United States. But I wouldn't read too much into that in terms of the broader relationship. I think the desire is still to maintain pragmatic relations with both. That's all I'll say since I'm moderating here, Fabiana, and I've already exceeded my allotment for my own analysis. Brian, I want to turn to you with a question from Kim Jasmine, who's one of my students at SAIS in a class on China and Latin America. She asks about China's role in multilateralism in Latin America and whether China is playing a role in facilitating multilateralism. I'll expand on the question and say whether the US should be concerned about China engaging in multilateral institutions. The last US administration, as you know, tried very hard to exclude China from playing a big role in the Inter-American Development Bank. China often engages through CELAC, which is an international institution that excludes the United States and tries to engage them directly with Latin Americans. So my question's for you. What is China's role in multilateralism? Is it strengthening it? Is it bringing the region together? And should the US be following its practices in that space?
It's an excellent question. And maybe it's a testament to your professorial, acumen. No, brilliant question. And I think it's perceptive. I mean, one of the things we've seen, particularly over the last administration, there was at least rhetoric that there was, last year's administration under, former President Trump, that there was at least some, consideration of, pulling out of multilateral arrangements and sort of ratcheting up more bilateral engagement. And I think there was this broader perception that the United States was going to start, creating a vacuum in these multilateral organizations. And I think at the same time, you saw China sort of throttle forward and increase its, its efforts to, build inroads with, with influential multilateral organizations. CELAC being, of course, a really important one in which, they've leveraged to deepen their relationships, expand relationships in the region. But there are other multilateral organizations in which you saw, you've seen the Chinese sort of grow. I mean, it's probably no surprise to anybody the slack that China's caught for its, its influence in the WHO, for example. This is quite a big story around COVID that, the Chinese had really become influential. And this was shaping some of the actions that the WHO was taking during the early period of the pandemic. And we've seen them, sort of play important roles in other really important multilateral organizations like the UN, picking up really important, positions within these multilateral organizations around economics and human rights. And so I think that China has recognized the importance of multilateral organizations as a means of facilitating its broader global outreach. And it sort of increased those at a time when it perceived the United States was going to be withdrawing from some of these multilateral arrangements in exchange for bilateral engagement. And I suspect that may change back with the incoming administration, taking more of a multilateral consensus approach to regional engagement. And maybe the US is going to start throttling forward a little bit more in these multilateral organizations and creating some competition with the Chinese for some of that space. But it's a great question. And I definitely think you've seen some movement and change in terms of the way we and others around the world have viewed the utility of multilateral organizations to facilitate the economic and the political, exchanges. So great question. That's the best answer I can give on the spot.
Brian, let me just follow up briefly and ask whether it's necessarily problematic for the United States. I mean, so if you take Latin American members in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or in the BRICS New Development Bank or participating in the Belt and Road Initiative, I think there's an inclination in the United States to see all that in the framework of competition. From the Latin American perspective, it's value added, it's technical support, and most of all, it's infrastructure finance. Should we be necessarily concerned every time Latin Americans engage with China in multilateral space?
No, and I think you're absolutely right. I think that, it took us a while to get past the China is threat discussion. And now we're talking China as competition, which I think again changes the way that we view the dynamics of the relationship. But again, going back to Fabiana, this idea of thinking about China as zero sum, I think is problematic for a variety of reasons. Notwithstanding, it limits our ability to leverage opportunities to engage China in meaningful collaboration that is at the advantage of all players in the space, right? Whether it's Latin American, communities, US, China, et cetera. And I think multilateral organizations could be a space in which a lot of that cooperation is born out of. And so I definitely think that, if we're going to engage, if there are areas in which we can engage China in a collaborative or coordinated environment, multilaterals might be a way for us to do that. But again, not to treat the relationship as a zero sum, and disaggregate the things that really threaten our interests versus the things that might amplify or enhance our interest, and then pursue them through the different levers that we have, bilateral or multilateral.
Thank you, Brian. Craig, we have a question from Kirsten Harris from Georgetown. She asks about whether we should also be considering Russia's role in Latin America, or whether China has so far surpassed Russia as an adversary with a presence in the region, so as to be, and I'm extrapolating here, less relevant to our strategic calculations. I'd like to start in Venezuela, if we could, where Russia clearly remains a major, if not decisive actor, and then broaden it a bit throughout the region.
Right. Well, and we have spent a lot of time talking about China, and I think I mentioned earlier, Russia is clearly a player, and Iran as a distant third. My concern with Russia is sort of in the very near term. Russia's interest in the region is as a spoiler, as others have said, it's geostrategic. It is less geoeconomic, as is the Chinese case. And so I am really not terribly concerned in the long term about Russia. Within Venezuela, I mean, that is a multi-generational challenge to overcome once between the people of Venezuela and the international community finally have the opportunity to start to rebuild that place. Russia's own internal challenges, demographic decline, an inability to truly harness their economy the same way that China has, makes it a very distant second, in my view, to China. If I may, I'd like to go back to I think Brian's excellent question on what is China doing wrong, and when Brian had pointed out that they're not, that most of their interactions are transactional, and I think that's by design. I mean, what other purpose could there be? What shared values does China have with a largely a Roman Catholic based, or at least founded civilization? There is none. It's transactional in economic terms. That is the huge value added that we have in the north part of this hemisphere, that we do share broad values of, certainly with the population, perhaps less so with certain authoritarian regimes, but in terms of liberties, of freedoms, of markets, of democracy as the least bad form of government. So that is clearly an opportunity that we need to take advantage of, and we need to do a much better job at public diplomacy. Again, one of the things that China is superb at is information operations and their public diplomacy. I mean, this is a country that characterize where the virus came from as you wish, but I think we would hopefully agree that that's where the virus originated, and which has caused death and destruction across the globe. And they're playing a savior role. It's as though you got run over by these guys, and they pick you up and offer to drive you to the clinic and charge you to take care of you. And and the individual who was run over is a willing participant in that exchange. It's truly impressive.
Thank you, Craig. Another question from one of my esteemed students, Carolina Echeverri, writes about 5G deployment in Latin America and how can the US and other powers get ahead in the technological race as Latin American countries seek to increase connectivity, develop smart cities, and/or surveillance technologies to fight crime and corruption. Let me just add to that and question, Fabiana, how much of a priority this should be. This was clearly, alongside Taiwan, one of the real red lines for the last US administration when looking at its relationships in Latin America and how we were trying to shape relationships with China, not only because of questions of counterintelligence, but also concerns about the dominance in these important sectors, the exporting to Latin America of potential technologies that could be used to, exert social control and repression. So Fabiana, how much should we care about 5G and the potential role of Huawei and other Chinese firms?
I think we should care, and I think this is another great example of different strings attached. I think at first glance, we could think of citizen security as an area that is prime for cooperation. We're interested in Latin American people feeling safe in their own countries. I don't know that China is interested, but it's not bad for them if they are, right? So you could have thought, oh, this is an area where our interests are shared. Let's cooperate, or let's find a way forward that includes both of us in citizen security. But here we see how our approaches to citizen security are a direct reflection of our views on the world. US approach to citizen security primes human rights above all and the protection of individual liberty. That is not what we see from Chinese approaches to the same problem. So I think here is where, again, I want to go back to my point about building bureaucratic institutional state capacity so they can look at both proposals and make a decision that is in the best interest of their own citizens. Ideally for us, the countries that are going to be evaluating these proposals are going to be democratic countries that share values with us, that are going to seek opportunities that do not involve the surveillance of their own citizens. So I would see this issue as very much tied to our view of the world and competition between democratic organization of the world and autocratic organization of the world. And to the extent that we value democratic organization of the world, which I would say very highly, then this issue should be very important to us.
Again, and I think the technologies, Fabiana, are in most cases are all dual use technologies that could be deployed in ways that are consistent with the values you're talking about. I guess my question for you related to that, Fabiana, and maybe this is also related to the environmental issues Brian has talked about, is might we not just trust Latin American governments to manage their relationship with China, whether it's on the environmental impacts of Chinese infrastructure finance, or in the case of these technologies that have these potentially negative impacts for democracy? Might we not just trust Latin American governments to handle it well? So why should we be so anxious that on behalf of these governments to say, beware of your engagement with a country that doesn't share these democratic values and doesn't share your concerns for social and environmental issues?
I think we trust our countries in Latin America to do what they think is the best interest of their citizens. As with so many issues, I think the more you know, the better decision you can make, right? Like, I used to know nothing about babies. Then I had a baby and I read about it all the time because I'm constantly trying to make the best decision for my son. I think the same would be true about Latin America. The more information they can be given on how to evaluate this, the more they'll be able to make the right decision. I don't think, and maybe I'm naive in this regard, but I don't think Latin American countries are on purpose going with the least expensive option or the one that gives them maybe a personal kickback. I believe in the patriotism of the bureaucrats working in Latin America, and I think we have a role to play in helping empower these bureaucrats to make the best decision they can for their own citizens.
Many thanks. Brian, turning to you, we have a question from Marilyn Mexicanos, an alumna of the Perry Center, who asks about Central America policy and the results that we've seen so far and what we might expect from our investments in the Northern Triangle. These are, of course, the troubled countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. It's a relevant question. I'm not sure the direct tie to China, except to say this is the kind of foreign engagement that really only falls to the United States, in my view, which is to say exactly the kind of institution building and support of democratic values and the fight against corruption that China simply will not supply. So the question, I guess, Brian, for you is, can the United States supply it now that the new U.S. administration has made this a very clear priority and promised significant funding, I think at least $1 billion per year over the next 4 years?
Man, if you can answer that question, then there's a spot for you in the White House. I mean, we have gone through several administrations that have made, significant investments in Central America. Of course, the Trump administration withdrew some of that, but notwithstanding that, not sort of getting into U.S. politics too much, but I think that there has been a steady flow of investment coming from the United States into Central America. And I would argue that it hasn't really moved the needle a whole lot. The Obama administration made significant investments. It didn't necessarily have the kind of impact on, stopping migration flows or impacting transnational organized crime as we have wanted it to. The Trump administration, I think, took a different approach, which was, to try to, firewall and force, Central Americans to tackle those issues themselves. Still didn't necessarily stop caravans from loading up and coming up the Central American corridor into Mexico and the United States. And we're here again, right? And so I have some serious concerns about whether or not U.S. assistance alone is going to be able to tackle this problem. You're absolutely right that China, Russia, no one else is going to make those kinds of investments in Central America because, frankly, it's just not a significant issue for them. It is a national, security and national interest for the United States, largely because of those two threads: immigration and of course transnational organized crime. We published recently, a colleague of yours, Ben, at the Wilson Center, Eric Olson and Joy Olson, published a fascinating piece on drivers of migration. And I keep bragging about the piece because I thought it was such a fascinating, nuanced view. And their argument was that certainly we have a good forensics on all of the drivers of migration. They include weak institutions, they include violence, they include limited economic opportunities, can't meet expectations for health and education, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's no shortage of issues that ultimately manifest into a calculation to leave the country. But what Joy and Eric argue is that it's all of those things that have a psychological effect on a sense of hopelessness that Central Americans have that ultimately is the tipping point for making that decision to leave. That it's hopelessness as a result of all these things that really propel people to take this very violent and difficult trek up through the Central American corridor, in which many cases, by the way, we've seen it can be just as violent as the homes that they left. Women and children being trafficked in the process. I mean, it's a disgusting process that is really difficult. And so, again, I think that, trying to re-inject a sense of hope in the future of Central American sustainable institutional development, I think could be a recipe for helping, address some of those sources of inspiration for leaving. But it all goes back to having the investments mapped to codifiable institutional, development and institution building that Fabiana and I think, Craig has hit on too. I think those are really vital. And so again, we're going to keep investing because we have to continue to invest, but we got to focus that investment on meaningful, long-term change. And we also have to stop thinking that it's going to change in one administration, right? I mean, this is a long-term, seemingly generational process that is going to, require a long time to truly build out, the kind of sustainable, meaningful change that we're looking for. And so we got to be consistent as a U.S. government in terms of making sure that we continue to sustain the kind of, effort needed over the long term. So I'll stop there, but yeah, tough question.
In just the few minutes we have left, I'm going to ask all three of you to respond in just a minute or two, starting with you, Craig, you, Fabiana, and then finishing with you, Brian, which is to turn this around and look at it from the Chinese perspective for a moment. We've acknowledged, and I think I agree with all of you, that Latin America is a key battleground in this global competition, and the U.S. is and should be interested. What about the prioritization for Beijing, which is to say, are there ways that the U.S.-Chinese relationship might improve through collaboration on climate or other areas of concern in the South China Sea in a way that we might collaborate in Latin America with the Chinese, convince the Chinese to be a more productive player in the Venezuela conflict, for example, or simply to diminish the Chinese presence in our near abroad in return for some actions elsewhere that are of less concern to the U.S. So the question, starting with you, Craig, how important is Latin America to China And is there a way that you see our relationship with China evolving so that we may shape China's engagement in this priority hemisphere?
Right. So, the answer to the second part of your question very quickly is no. Right. I think China has global ambitions. I think we ignore those or minimize those at our peril. That clearly I'm attacking this from a rather realpolitik standpoint, if it wasn't clear before. And so, is there an opportunity? Yes, there's an opportunity to actually pay attention to our own hemisphere and neighborhood, and let the Chinese know that there are certain activities that we simply will not abide. Again, if the Chinese want to lend or purchase or do those sorts of things, the countries in the region are sovereign. They can make those decisions. I think the role of the U.S. is to advise as to some of the second and third order effects and the additional costs that will ensue by some of those decisions. And to piggyback on your previous question about why not just let the countries in the region make those decisions? Well, I would humbly submit that the evidence would suggest that they haven't made those best decisions, right? The elites over the past, pick a number of years, have made decisions that have contributed to, with 8% of the world's population producing close to 40% of the world's homicides, so levels of violence are highest anywhere in the world. The level of economic poor maldistribution of wealth are among the top 10 countries in the world are located in Latin America. Elites have not prioritized their citizens. They have prioritized their own well-being. And so I think there is a positive role for the U.S. to play, but it's going to require a lot more attention and engagement. And again, because this is our neighborhood, we absolutely should dedicate more time and effort to that end.
Fabiana, is there an opportunity diplomatically, strategically for the United States to impact how Beijing interacts in Latin America?
I think there will be an opportunity, but perhaps not one that's created by diplomacy, but rather by the conditions of the international system. I think the relationship between the United States and China is one of competition, and it's going to stay one of competition. I don't think there's anything we can say that will get Beijing to say, oh, gee, I hadn't thought about it that way. Definitely, let's have elections. I don't think that that's possible. I do think that if China truly does have global ambitions, it is going to face the same constraints that the United States faces, which is even as a global power, you can't be all things to everyone all the time. And they might seek to emphasize and de-emphasize areas in which they're engaged. I think my hope is that as they evaluate how best to focus their efforts, they might be interested in pivoting away from supporting countries like Venezuela that haven't necessarily turned out to be big gains for them yet. And that as China vacates that space, it creates again an opportunity for the United States to engage again from a stronger position. So I think it's more this, it's going to be more the prioritization and the deciding on their part on how and when to engage that might create opportunities for the United States rather than diplomatic rhetoric that I think is not going to be enough to bridge this chasm.
Brian, how do you see it? We've got 2 minutes and they're yours. Is there a way through negotiations and diplomacy to reshape how China engages in Latin America, maybe including but not exclusively in Venezuela, where it really is a critical actor in maintaining the political status quo?
I think Craig and Fabiana hit it. I mean, the answer is yes. And I think we're doing some of those things to try to shape behavior in a way that is consistent with, with the values and beliefs that we hold and we think should be upheld for the region, for example. And I think to Fabiana's point, just kind of build off of it, I think as China continues its sort of rise as a global power, there are going to be other things that are sort of, forced onto China, like responsibility, like global responsibility. I mean, China is already starting to care somewhat about its brand. And I think you see this, you saw this a lot with the outbreak of the pandemic, and how China was really forced to, really preoccupied with how the world was going to view it going forward, and really trying to make sure that, it kind of, as Craig said, at least drove the car to the hospital to do something, to, kind of wipe out the fact that this brand is going to be a real problem. I mean, the charm offensive is a real thing. I mean, China is concerned about that. And as it continues to expose itself globally, it's going to have to think meaningfully about what that brand is going to look like. And I think that's where, the United States has an option. And I'll seize the last 20 seconds, though, to kind of shift and say we spent a lot of time talking about China. And I think that's right. I think China is absolutely the strategic, competitor of the region. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about Russia, although Craig hit on it. I think Russia, as a distant second, is still really important. My fear, though, is that Russia is probably maybe a little bit more dangerous in the near term. My fear about Russia is that there's no hesitation to light a match and walk away. And when you look at places like Venezuela, I'm quite fearful that, once Russia feels its time is up, it has no problem in sowing as much chaos as possible in order to preoccupy the United States and others in this hemisphere with the unfolding crisis. So I'm more concerned about a near term, Russia lighting a match and walking away. But we also got to keep our eye on this longer term strategic competitor, which is China, and what they could, what they can ultimately do in the region that's just, sort of antithetical to our interests. Anyway, try to do our best I can in 2 minutes, but thanks, Ben.
You did great, Brian. Thank you, as did you, Fabiana, and you, Craig. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I appreciate it. Jim, over to you. Thank you again for hosting such an important conversation.
No, thanks. Thanks, Benjamin. And really, first of all, I just want to thank all of the panel members, Craig, Brian, and Fabiana. Thank you very much for just illuminating us on this topic. And Benjamin, thank you for moderating. Really brought in some good questions. And then really to the whole audience for being really active. I see over 20 questions that were asked. So that's really a success on the topic, and obviously the moderator and each one of the speakers. So that concludes this panel. This is our third panel for the day. So we still have the keynote address that'll be coming up. That'll be given by the former Minister of Defense of Colombia, Honorable Juan Carlos Pinzon. And then after that, we have our fourth panel that will take place shortly thereafter. So for right now, we'll take a quick 15-minute break, and then we'll move on to the keynote address, which will start at 1:45 p.m. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll see everybody in 15 minutes.